Hello, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you for another online presentation. Really appreciate you joining me today, and I also appreciate if you're watching the recording of this that we put up on YouTube. If you are watching on YouTube, I encourage you to do two things. First, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and that'll help you find out about future programs that we upload. And it also, if you have any questions, if you're watching the YouTube video, just go ahead. You can put those down in the comment section. It's a really easy way that you can get those questions to me. Answered some questions in the YouTube comment section earlier today. Always happy to do that. And of course, you're also perfectly free to give me a call here at the county extension office. The number is right here on this first page. That's 228-467-5456. And please also, if you'd like, send me an email. Email is right there as well. That's c.stevenson@msstate.edu. I do my best to respond to you as fast as I possibly can. So today we're going to have a really interesting topic. We've had two sessions already just talking about plant diversity, where we talked a little bit about the major groups of plants. We talked about the phyla, so really large groups of plants that incorporate a lot of diversity within them. We've also talked about plant families and a little bit about some of the different plant families that you might encounter in the home landscape. So what I wanted to do today was talk about some interesting plants or some unusual plants or plants that have some interesting characteristics about them. So today should be some fun and just kind of an exploration of the plant kingdom and all of the really interesting diversity that is within it. And I want to start off talking about carnivorous plants. Of course, we're very familiar with the idea that plants get their energy through photosynthesis. And so we don't think about them doing anything other than collecting
Alexa,
nutrients from the
set
soil.
an alarm for 20 minutes.
Of course, using sunlight for that process of photosynthesis to get their energy. But there are some plants that are adapted to getting a little bit of additional nutrition from capturing insects or in some cases, small mammals and lizards and things like that. One thing that is interesting about carnivorous plants is that they occur in several different groups or families of the plant kingdom. And they have all sort of come at the method that they use to capture insects in different ways. So it's a really good example of what's called convergent evolution, where there's an advantageous characteristic that an organism may have, and there are different pathways that evolution can take to get to that quality. Oftentimes, carnivorous plants live in areas where, particularly low resource areas, places where there are limited resources. You might very frequently find them in areas that are kind of boggy. And so they aren't particularly well adapted to areas where soil resources are abundant. They can be outcompeted by other plants. There's, of course, there is a conservation threat to a lot of these carnivorous plants just from habitat loss. So they're really interesting. We're going to talk about several different kinds of carnivorous plants and where you might find them and how they operate. Of course, probably the one people are really familiar with is the Venus flytrap. It's a really interesting plant. Does very well as a small container plant that you can keep, in your house, on a desk, or something like that. And their natural range is a very small area. They're only found in North Carolina and South Carolina, about a 75-mile radius around Wilmington. They tend to grow in areas with moist, acidic soil, which again, something that you're going to see a lot as we talk about carnivorous plants. Of course, the thing that everybody's familiar with about the Venus flytrap is they have those two hinged lobes at the end of their leaves, and their trichomes or little hairs inside of that. You can see that in the top picture there. And that allows them to detect contact, and that will cause the leaf to close around the insect that causes that contact. One thing that I use Venus flytraps for as a demonstration, particularly if I'm talking to young people, is you can do something really interesting with them. Of course, you can cause them to close those lobes on their leaves by contacting those little trichomes. You can use a needle or a pen or something like that. And what's really interesting to me is that one contact won't do it. You actually have to contact a couple of the hairs. So you can say that the Venus flytrap is a plant that has learned to count. And that's an adaptation to, the plant doesn't want to go to the energy cost of closing that trap with nothing in there. Another interesting thing about Venus flytraps is that just like all flowering plants, they have flowers, and those flowers are very effectively pollinated by insects. What you'll find is the flowers tend to rise up a good bit higher than where those lobes are, or where the trap is. And so the kinds of insects that act in pollination don't tend to be the kinds of insects that would be what gets captured by that trap. So they have a really effective way of separating out and making sure that their pollinators aren't affected and don't become their food source. Another kind of carnivorous plant you may be familiar with is the sundew. They're in the genus Drosera. And unlike the Venus flytrap, they don't have a lobe that closes. They have those trichomes or hairs on their leaves, and those leaves or those trichomes produce a nectar that is very attractive to insects, but also serves as an adhesive. So the insect, comes in and is attracted to that nectar, wants to use it as a food source, and gets trapped in that material. And then the trichomes or tentacles will coil around it and smother the insect. Sundews are pretty well distributed. Unlike Venus flytrap, they occur everywhere. We absolutely have them here in Mississippi, and very often people will find them in wet areas of their yard. Or if you have the opportunity to go up to the DeSoto National Forest, there are some really great locations where you can see these. The ones that I normally see are very small, just really close to the ground. There are some other species within the Drosera genus that are quite large. Of course, they tend to be tropical. You can see a picture of one of those down on the bottom that has those really long stems, really long leaves with those trichomes all over it. So just a really interesting carnivorous plant as well. Now, another one we should definitely be familiar with from here, particularly in South Mississippi, is the pitcher plant. There are a lot of different species of these, and they have these really heavily modified leaves that are fused into a tube. And often there's going to be kind of a hood-like section of that leaf that covers over the end of that tube, just to prevent rainwater from collecting in there and just filling it up. That opening is generally very brightly colored, and there's a little bit of nectar-like fluid that's secreted down into the bottom of that tube in order to lure insects in. And now I'm certainly not going to tell you to go out and collect a bunch of pitcher plants because we do want to conserve these. But it can be interesting when you open up the bottom of that and just see all of the things that get drawn into them. I also think pitcher plants have just a really interesting flower. You can see a picture of that over on the right side. It comes up on that long stem. It tends to be kind of facing downwards. Now the pitcher plants we have here are relatively small. They, maybe 8 inches or so. There are some much larger examples that are found in other parts of the world. I've included a picture of one of those. And not only will they occasionally capture things like insects, but they also might be able to capture small mammals and things like that. So they can be quite large and just a really interesting plant. Another one that you might find here in Mississippi is Butterwort. This is a fairly unassuming little plant. Again, tends to have kind of a rosette really close down to the surface or the top of the ground. Um, and again, actually have a really attractive flower. You can see that picture down in the bottom with those really, really nice kind of lavender colored flowers that come out of those plants. In this case, their mechanism for working is really simple. Their leaves are just kind of sticky, and they curl into a cup. And very often, when you find these, you'll find gnats just sticking to those leaves because of that sticky material that the plant excretes. Um, for the butterworts, they do have a root system. That root system really just acts as an anchor. It doesn't provide any nutrition for the plant. And you will find them in sunny, open areas, and particularly, again, in wet areas throughout the southeastern United States. One that I think is really interesting, this is an aquatic example of a carnivorous plant. It's called Bladderwort. And one of the things that's really interesting about them is the way that their trap works. We don't think about plants moving quickly. We don't tend to think about plants moving at all. But in the case of bladderwort, they can actually move relatively fast, at least a little part of them that serves as a trap. So are all these little traps distributed along stems. There may be hundreds on an individual plant. And a lot of times these are quite small. They're just a size of a pinhead or just a little bit bigger than that.
Oh, good.
And so that trap is just a little open space, and it has a covering that is watertight and has a sealant made of mucilage or some material that the plant excretes. And there are two types of hairs that are on the surface of that trap. There are guide hairs that kind of direct any potential prey to that trap. And then there are trigger hairs, just like you would see on the Venus flytrap. And when those trigger hairs that line the trap entrance are contacted, that trap snaps open really, really quickly in just thousandths of a second. And there's a low pressure area inside that trap that pulls the water and the unsuspecting insect into it. And then the trap is sealed again. The water is pumped out. And you have just a really interesting little mechanism for the plant to get that nutrition that it gets from the insect. And again, for carnivorous plants, often what you're seeing is plants that are growing in areas where it's hard to get the nutrients that we need. So nitrogen is very limiting. So they really need to get that from another source. And so that's where you're very commonly going to see these carnivorous plants. It's just a really good example of an interesting adaptation in plants to those conditions. Now, another kind of interesting plant, we're going to get away from carnivorous plants, are epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that are growing on other plants. So they may be growing completely out of contact with the ground. And we have just a really great example of one of these here, particularly in the southern part of Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama. and that is Spanish moss. Now, it is a member of the Bromeliaceae, so it's in the same group as all the bromeliads, and it is a perennial epiphytic herb. So it has no roots. If you see it growing on a plant, we often see it on oak trees and other large trees, and it doesn't actually derive any nutrients from the plant that it is on top of. It is just using that plant as a structure to grow on. And one reason why you might see epiphytes is because plants have to compete with one another for nutrients and for sunlight, and particularly in forested areas where you may have a lot of shade, there's a lot of advantage in getting up into the canopy of another plant where you can collect some of that sunlight. Um, Again, they have no roots. They derive all of their nutrients from rainfall or detritus, or so things that fall into the into contact with the Spanish moss, just airborne dust that blows around, and all of their stems and their leaves are covered with kind of a silver gray scale that helps them absorb water and trap dust and nutrient particles that they need. Now, you don't often see it, but Spanish moss does have some really nice small blue-green flowers that you'll see on the leaf axils if you go looking for them. And Spanish moss has a lot of history being used as a material. It's been used as a packing material. It's been used to make cordage or twine or rope. It's also been used to make bedding because it kind of has a nice kind of springy quality to it. It's also really important as a nesting material for some birds and other animals. And if you ask me, it just looks really attractive as a kind of gives you that nice classic southern feel when you drive down a road and see all the Spanish moss draping off the oak off of those live oak trees. Now, another group of plants that includes an awful lot of epiphytes are the orchids. We've talked about orchids a little bit before. It is the second largest family of flowering plants behind the Asteraceae. And there is a fantastic amount of diversity in orchids. A lot of that is due to the specialized nature of their pollination. So a lot of orchids are only pollinated by one or a very small group of insects, and so they're very closely adapted along with that insect to make sure that they have a good commensal relationship where they're both benefiting. The orchids have a modified epidermis on their root that allows them to absorb water. That's just the outer surface of the root. And some of them do have a sort of bulb-like structure that allows them to store nutrients and store water. They are perennials, and there are different growth patterns for orchids. Some of them have a stem that grows from a single bud. Leaves are added each year. It's what we call monopodial. And some of them are sympodial, where they have several shoots that sort of bloom and are replaced. We do have quite a few orchids that are native here to Mississippi. There are about 50 native orchid species. We're really fortunate down here on the coast. There's about 30 of those species occur only south of Hattiesburg, and about 20 of them occur only in the 3 coastal counties. Now, the majority of our native orchids are going to be terrestrial. They grow on the ground. The only native epiphyte in the United States north of Florida grows here, and that is the green fly orchid. You see a picture of that there on the left. And we commonly see them growing along rivers and lakes, areas where there's a lot of humidity. And a lot of them, again, are found in areas that are tend to be really wet. One thing that can be kind of frustrating about orchids is that for them to flower and grow, the conditions just need to be just right And so sometimes they'll stay dormant for several years until those right conditions come along, and that allows for the growth of the plant. Not, this is kind of a segue or an introduction between a plants that are epiphytes and plants that are parasitic. So Strangler Fig is a really interesting plant. There are a number of different species that get called this, all in the genus Ficus, and they're actually fairly commonly used as ornamental trees, and they will grow on their own. But strangler figs really like to grow on a on another tree. And what they'll do is, as they grow on that tree, they're using that tree for support. Their root system will go down to the ground and encircle the roots of that other tree, cutting off its supply of food and water, and ultimately resulting in the death of that host tree. It's also pretty interesting. Their seeds are sticky, and that will cling up in the roots or clefts in another tree's canopy. And so they start to develop as an epiphyte, and then they send roots down to the ground in order to establish that ground contact. They use that other tree for support. They do eventually send roots down to the ground. Their leaves, which can be really nice and attractive, kind of overshadow the other plant. And one thing that I think is particularly interesting, and I've shown a couple of examples of it here, is that, of course, when that host tree dies, it may rot away. But by the time that happens, the strangler fig may be big enough to actually live without the support of the host tree. And so it leaves that really interesting sort of open structure of the plant where the original or that host tree was located. So really kind of an interesting example there. Now, there are some plants that are parasitic. We've talked about one of these previously, and that is dodder. Dodder is found throughout the United States and Canada. It is an annual seed-bearing parasitic vine, and it has really sort of thin thread-like stems, and it grows just entwining and covering up other plants. Up in the very top right there, you can see a plant that just has a big infestation of dodder. It's also a pretty significant problem out in agricultural fields as it starts growing in amongst the row crops that we're trying to grow. Seeds germinate in the soil, and the plant can actually live on its own for a very short period of time. So 5 to 10 days, it can live, coming up out of the ground. But after that, if it's not able to find a host, the dodder will die. So what it does is it vines around this other plant, and it inserts a structure called a hostoria or hostorium into the other plant. You can see a picture of that down on the bottom there, and that it gets into the vascular system of the other plant and will pull out water and mineral and nutrients in order to feed itself to the detriment of its host plant. Another really interesting example of a parasitic plant is what's called ghost plant. There are several other names for this, and there are several other species that have very similar habits. So you may have heard of Dutchman's pipe as another example that's within this group. And this is a perennial wildflower that you tend to find in shaded forests. You can find it throughout most of the United States. It is relatively rare. If you ever find it, make sure you take a really good picture. You don't tend to find it in the Southwest, but the plant itself ranges in height anywhere from 10 to 30 centimeters, which would be 4 to 12 inches, 4 to 13 inches, somewhere in there. And one thing that I think just makes it really stand out is the entire plant is this really translucent white. And of course, chlorophyll is how plants get that green color. So not having chlorophyll is why the plant is white. Um, you do have a kind of scale-like leaves that are flecked with a little bit of black on the flower stalk, and you get one flower off of that stem. One thing that's really interesting about ghost plants is they absolutely do feed on nutrients and carbohydrates from tree roots, but there's an intermediate step. So there are fungi called mycorrhizae that live in association with the roots of the plant, and they get some benefit from the plant. And the ghost plant is actually growing in association with those fungi. So it is parasitic on the plant ultimately, but it has that intermediate step involved. But just a really interesting plant as well. So wanted to segue here again. We're just talking about some interesting stuff that plants do. And I mentioned already that we don't often think about plants moving very much. Of course, we do think about plants moving, flowers moving to face sunlight, and things like that. But we certainly don't think about them moving quickly. So there are a couple of examples of plants that will move relatively quickly and move in response not only to touch, but to things like sound. So Mimosa pudica, or what's called humble plant or shame plant sometimes, will respond to touch by rapidly closing up its leaves and drooping. It's native to Central and South America, but it is sometimes grown in greenhouses as just a curiosity, as an interesting plant to have around. And it has these specialized cells that are located at the bases of the leaf and at the base of the leaf stalk. And when the plant is contacted, that water is rapidly removed from those cells, and that allows the plant to kind of droop down and change its shape. It's probable, though of course we don't really have a full understanding of this, that a lot of this is just a way to avoid being eaten by herbivores, because herbivores as a rule don't tend to expect their food source to try to move away from them. So it can be a little bit startling. What I think is really interesting is you can kind of get the plant to droop down, but over a very short period of time, just a few minutes, those leaves will kind of come back up and open back up. So a really interesting plant, and actually a really fun plant to keep around. Another good example of this is what's called the telegraph plant, or occasionally the dancing plant. And if you look up the species for this, that's undergone some work fairly recently. So you may see it as a different scientific name, depending on how long ago the article you're reading was written. Very similar to the humble plant or shame plant, telegraph plants have a ring of cells at the base of leaflets, and they'll quickly move that water out, and that causes those cells to shrink. And what I find interesting is that it actually reacts very easily to sound, and so as if you play music for the plant, if you play it loud enough, it looks like the plant's kind of dancing along with the music, which I think is just really fascinating. Of course, again, you're looking at an adaptation of the plant to avoid either moths or butterflies laying eggs on it that would then feed on the plant, because it's very easy if the plant moves to startle those things away. And there's also been some speculation that it may actually be able to dislodge any caterpillars that might be feeding on it by moving the leaves and shaking around just a little bit. Now, I've talked about mimicry a little bit when I've talked about insects, and because we think of examples of Insects that are mimics. The really classic example of that is the viceroy butterfly, which is a mimic of the monarch. Of course, the monarch butterfly feeds on milkweed and has a lot of the distasteful and kind of toxic compounds collected in its body to avoid predation by birds. The viceroy butterfly's adaptation is just to look like the monarch. And so by doing that, it's able to avoid predation without having to go to all of the effort of feeding just on milkweed. There is some interesting mimicry that goes on in plants as well. And the first example that I'm going to use is passion flower or passion vine in the genus Passiflora, which, first of all, is just a great plant in the landscape and has a really interesting flower. But there are some butterfly larvae that really like to feed on passion flower. Particularly, there is a passion vine fritillary that is a major pest for passion flower vines. And if you look at the leaf there on the right side of the screen, you can see those yellow dots along that leaf. And those look very much like what the yellow eggs would for one of these butterflies. And so the thinking is that the butterfly will see those yellow dots, say, you know, something's already put their eggs here, so I don't want to. So, you know, because I don't want my young having to compete for the food source. So that allows the passion vine to deter that oviposition and avoid being fed on by the caterpillars. Kind of a little bit different. I don't know if this really goes into uh, mimicry so much as just a plant that looks at like something else. There are a group of plants called lithops, and they are very commonly called living stones. Now, these plants are native to South Africa. And if you looked at the sort of the middle picture on the top there, guess the top picture on the left, if I was just shown that picture and asked to identify the plant in that picture, it really does look very much like a rock. And so I might have some difficulty picking that one out of a lineup. And these plants are extraordinarily well adapted to live in dry areas. They're really made up just of those two really succulent leaves, and they're shaped kind of as an inverted cone. So up in the picture on the top right, you can kind of see the full structure of the plant there, and they have a fissure at the top between those two leaves, and those wide leaf tips. Of course, plants need to photosynthesize. So there's kind of a window or an area that light can actually pass through to get down to the part of the plant where the light is needed for photosynthesis. They don't have any stem. The taproot is just right there at the base of their leaves. And those leaves are also really thick and they allow them to store a lot of water. So even in areas where you might go months without rain, those plants can survive. And they'll, if it's really dry, they'll just shrivel up and shrink below the soil. And when there's water again, they'll come back out. One thing that I think is really great about these plants, I mean, they're great. If you have a pot where you're putting succulents in, I think these are a great addition, not only because they're kind of an interesting conversation piece as a plant, but some of them actually have some really striking flowers that come out kind of right in the middle of that cleft between those two leaves. And so they can be really attractive as well. Now, of course, we all love flowers, and we love flowers for the overall beauty and the bright colors that they have. But we also like to give people flowers because they smell nice. But there are some flowers that don't smell particularly nice. I'm going to talk about just a couple of those. The first of these is what is very commonly called the corpse flower, the Rafflesia arnoldii. It is a really good example of several of the things we talked about. It is a parasitic plant. It lives on members of the genus Tradostigma, which is a kind of grapevine, or it's at least in the genus Phytaceae that grapevine is in. And the majority of the time this plant is there, you don't see it at all. It's entirely inside the woody stems and the root system of its host, except when buds emerge out through the bark of the host. And once it does this, it produces the largest known flower in the world. So that flower is several feet across, and is really quite large, and also smells absolutely terrible. It smells like rotting meat, and having that smell allows it to attract carrion flies. Things like the sarcophagi, the flies that would normally be attracted to something dead, and then pollen adheres to the backs of those flies, and that allows the plant to be pollinated. Another really good example of one of these is of a similar plant or a plant that has a similarly bad aroma, is the Titan arum. And this is a really interesting plant. People will travel and go to botanic gardens to see when a Titan arum flowers. You'll often hear about it as being the largest flower, but the big stalk or big flower stalk that you see there is actually, which can be 6 to 8 feet tall, is actually made up of many, many, many small flowers. So it does have the largest single inflorescence of any in the plant kingdom. Interestingly, it can take quite a while for this plant to bloom. Initially, what you can plant it as a corm, very similar to a bulb, and it may take 10 years for that plant to accumulate enough energy in order to produce one of these massive blooms. Once it does that, again, it's used an awful lot of energy, so it may only bloom every 4 to 7 years following that. The blooms themselves are interesting. Of course, again, they don't smell very good. They're there to attract flesh flies and carrion beetles that get down into the bottom of that and get a lot of pollen all around them, and allow that pollen to be spread. Uh, Interesting, they also generate a little bit of heat as they're going through the blooming process. So the temperature will get up around 90 degrees in that inflorescence. Blooms do not last very long. They only bloom for 1 to 2 days. And once they're done, they actually produce a large number of berries. You can see a picture of that up at the top. And those berries are very popular with hornbills, and so they feed on those berries, and that's one of the ways that this plant is dispersed. So another really interesting plant. Besides smelling bad, another thing that can be a little bit unpleasant for plants is that some of them can actually sting you. I have had the experience of stinging nettle. Someone brought a plant in for identification and had it in just a regular paper bag. I reached my hand in to pull the plant out, and before I needed to even look at the plant, I knew what I had was stinging nettle. Um, Stinging nettle is extraordinarily broadly distributed. It's almost worldwide. It's often found in sites along streams and meadows and ditches. Really likes disturbed areas, despite the fact that it has all of these little tiny hairs on it, again called trichomes. And when you get in contact with that trichome, you'll break off the tip of it, and then it injects the contents, which contain things like histamine and serotonin and acetylcholine, causes contact dermatitis, so you get a rash from it, and it really is quite unpleasant. Um, Despite this, it is a very common host for some butterfly larvae, and people actually you can eat stinging nettle. It's very important to cook it to get rid of all of those trichomes. But I am told that it tastes very similar to spinach. And a lot of people were really interested in stinging nettle as potentially an anti-inflammatory, which I think is interesting, having had the inflammation caused by coming in contact with it. And if you ever hear someone use the term nettled, it is pretty well considered that that term actually comes from the stinging nettle. As a another example of a plant that can cause stinging, and this one is much more serious, and of course comes from Australia. There is the Gimpy plant, um, and it is common to rainforest areas, particularly in northeast Australia, and very similar to the stinging nettle. It has these hairs that cover the entire plant. And should you come in contact with it, that potent toxin is released. These really attractive, large, heart-shaped leaves, and the pain that is associated with Gimpy with contact with this tree is quite serious, and can last for a significant period of time. So it may continue to hurt for, stinging nettle. It hurt for a few minutes. Contact with this plant can cause pain lasting weeks. So a very, very good plant to avoid completely. That being said, the fruit is edible. I'm not sure how they figured that out, but you have to make sure you remove all those stinging hairs. And there are marsupials and insects and birds that do feed on this plant. Another example of a plant that has a really effective defense against herbivory. Of course, stinging nettle and gimpy plants have those defenses to prevent things from eating them, is giant hogweed. And this is a plant that is now found in the United States, but only up in the Northeast. Is a biennial or perennial herb. It can get up to 14 feet tall. Has hollow stems that can be 2 to 4 inches in diameter, and it has these really large compound flowers that kind of make it really easy to identify as a member of the same family as carrot. Um, was actually introduced as an ornamental garden plant. I would never suggest that someone have this in their garden, because the sap of giant hogweed is what's called phototoxic. So if you have the sap on you, that contact prevents your skin from being able to defend itself from sunlight, and so you can get quite serious burns on you as a result of contact with the sap of giant hogweed. Another example of a tree that can cause a lot of problems. This is the Manikil tree. It's a member of the spurge family, and it has the distinction of being considered the most dangerous tree in the world. Every single part of the tree is poisonous. It grows in Florida and some areas of the Caribbean. It's often found along beaches and swampy environments. And any contact with the tree whatsoever, it has a kind of a white sap. It will cause blistering of the skin, and it will cause conjunctivitis, or your eyes to turn red. It will actually cause blindness for several days. And should you be so unfortunate as to eat it, it can cause very, very serious poisoning. The Some of the names for this tree are the little apple of death, and Oftentimes, any tree that's in a area where the public may be is actually labeled with warning signs to prevent people from coming in contact with it. If you happen to be out in the rain, you do not want to even sit under a Manikil tree because the toxin in the sap is water soluble, and so the rain will actually get that toxin down onto your skin. So very, very dangerous plant. That is also really popular in making furniture. So you can see a picture of that dresser up there in the top right. Um, Manikil wood is a very valuable material for making furniture and lumber, uh, and the tree has to be harvested very carefully. Traditionally, they would do this by burning the tree at the base to get it to fall over. You have to do this from afar because the smoke of the burning tree is actually toxic itself. But once the plant is laid out in the sun, and that will destroy that toxic sap. And it actually it has a beautiful wood that's been used in furniture for quite a long time. Okay, so we're getting to just some different examples of plants that I just found interesting for different reasons. One of these is miracleberry. It is a evergreen shrub that's native to West Africa. Has those really nice looking red fruit that are about an inch long. What's particularly interesting about this plant is that those fruit contain a chemical called miraculin. It's a glycoprotein, so it's protein with a sugar added to it. And that glycoprotein, miraculin, binds to taste buds and causes any acidic food to taste sweet. So you can buy miracle berries, you can buy them dried and have them shipped to you, and you chew them up really thoroughly and make sure you've gotten that on your tongue. And it really is remarkable. So you can make just raw lemon juice taste like lemonade, and that effect will last for maybe a half hour. I think in my experience, the dried examples just don't last very long, but really interesting and something that people kind of consume as a novelty, but just has that really interesting chemical. Another plant that has a kind of an interesting use. This is the soapberry plant. It's actually quite a large tree. It's about 30 to 40 feet tall. It has some pretty innocuous little white flowers. What's interesting is that there are a lot of saponins in the fruit. So the little berries that form, again, about an inch long, are, when mixed with water very thoroughly, kind of have a soaping effect. And so they can be used and have been traditionally used for making soap and making a kind of like a laundry soap as a natural material. I've had the experience of interacting with Soapberry tree. We were taking a tour, and I was very, very curious. And so I wanted to kind of sample that. And what I found is that without access to water, the berries are extraordinarily sticky. So you want to make sure if you mess with them, you have an ample supply of water to get that material off of your hands. That being said, afterwards, my hands were very clean. Just a interesting plant, primarily for the size of it. This is the giant water lily, the Victoria amazonica, also occasionally called the Amazonian water lily. Um, and what's really remarkable about this, of course, like other water lilies, it grows in water, and the leaves float on the surface of the water. And those leaves can be 10 feet in diameter, so very, very large. You'll often see pictures with people standing next to them to demonstrate their size, and just a really striking leaf to look at. I also think they have really interesting flowers. You can see a picture there on the top. Very attractive flower. when they first come up, the flowers are white, just a really striking white color. The flowers will open in the day, and then they close at night. They've attracted pollinating beetles in there, and so the beetles sort of feed inside there, getting all covered in pollen. Open up later, let the beetles go off to share their pollen. One interesting thing about the flowers, additionally, is while they start off white, over time, over the period of a couple of days, there's anthocyanins that are released, and so they'll turn a really nice pink or red over time. So we had an example of a really big plant. So now we're going to have an example of a really small one. So these are the smallest plants there are, often called watermeal or duckweed, and all in the genus Wolfia. And they average somewhere between 1/42nd of an inch or 1/80 to 1/85th of an inch wide. So that is a really, really tiny little plant. Good way to think of it is that one individual plant weighs about the same as 2 grains of table salt. Another way to think of it is if you had a thimble, you could fit about 5,000 of these into a thimble. The watermeal is found on the surface of ponds, other areas with slowly moving water. And they also have a really tiny flower. You can see those little kind of specks up there at the top, little darker areas. That is a flower. It consists of just one single pistil and one single stamen. And they also produce the world's smallest fruit. Watermeal is occasionally eaten as a vegetable. It's supposed to taste a little bit like sweet cabbage, but it's supposed to be very high in protein and very high in essential nutrients. So kind of an interesting example, and just remarkable how the plant can be adapted to be so small. I wanted just to give kind of another kind of interesting adaptation that plants can have to their environment. And so I want to talk about mangroves. And in mangrove, the word can be used several different ways. So as I'm talking about it, I'm talking about one specific or a group of specific plants. But we could also talk about mangrove forests, and those are forests that are growing in kind of brackish areas or coastal areas. But the mangroves I'm talking about, of course, they do live along coastlines. They're very well adapted to that high salt conditions, the brackish water. But what the quality that I'm really interested in here is that mangroves have viviparous seed. So viviparous term means you give birth to live young. And so in the case of mangroves, the seeds, and you see that up at the top there, the seeds will actually stay attached to the parent plant and will germinate right there on the parent plant. And so the little green section that you see extending from the kind of brownish fruit is actually the new plant. And then as the tide is up, those what are called propagules or those new live plants will drop off of the parent tree, and the tide and the water can carry them off to a new location. So again, just kind of something that you don't think of too often. Occasionally, you'll find a tomato fruit that has had the seed in it germinate, but that's not the normal method of germination for a tomato. But in mangroves, that's a kind of an adaptation to the environment that they live in, because it allows those new plants to either root right there really quickly, establish in a difficult area, or allows them to be carried off to be established somewhere else. So the Three Kings Kaikamako is interesting because of its rarity. This is a plant that was about as critically endangered as a plant could possibly be. There was only one of them in the wild. So there was only one example of this. It was located on Great Island in New Zealand. And one of the reasons why it and other species on this island, it's part of the Three Kings group of islands. In the years ago, goats were introduced to the island, and the goats went out and fed as they do, and resulted in a lot of the plants there, being endangered. So goats were removed from the island in the 1940s, but there was only one example of this plant living in the wild. It was a female tree, and it was possible to propagate it by cuttings, but it is also possible to get hybrids of it. But true reproduction for the plant was very difficult. They were able to produce mature seed from this by using some treating it with some plant hormones to actually produce mature seed, and allowed them to rescue this plant from almost certain extinction. So, kind of an interesting story of a success in conservation, though it is still endangered. It's not quite as endangered as being down to just one individual. So I'm gonna just another really interesting plant. This is the Great Basin bristlecone pine, Pinus longeva, and it is remarkable as the species with the oldest known trees. They are native to high elevations in the southwestern United States, some areas of California, and the oldest known tree has been dated to just over 5,000 years. They're really well adapted to cold environments. They're generally found at elevations above 17,000 feet. They grow very slowly. They're usually in very poor soil, in kind of limestone areas. And as they grow very slowly, they produce an incredibly dense wood that is very resistant to insect and diseases and erosion. They're also growing in areas where there's not a lot of competition. They're a little bit less prone to being damaged by wildfires. And just a really example, just extraordinarily well adapted to longevity. They move so slowly that even the needles, and of course, we think of pine trees here, and the general massive pine trees that we need, pine needles that we need to rake up. But in the case of these bristlecone pines, they can actually keep those needles for as long as 30 years. So just a really interesting plant in terms of how long it can survive. So I appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you enjoyed it. We're just looking at the wide range of plants that are out there, some of their interesting adaptations to their environments, and the strange ways that they can live. So appreciate it. Again, if you have any questions, if you're watching the recording of this on YouTube, I would encourage you to go ahead and hit the subscribe button, as well as write your question down in the comment section, and I'll be very happy to come back and answer that. So thank you very much.